Welcome back. My name is Sam Hassel, and in today's episode, we are going to be discussing why hobbies are admissions cheat codes. So, very often on this podcast, we focus on the resume building part of the process, and in particular, the connection of building a resume to a student's admissions hook, right? What that main core theme is going to be in terms of their passions, their interests, and what they are really more or less selling the college on and presenting the college in their applications. What this story is that they're painting for the college in terms of what they really enjoy, what they love, what they would come to the college to study and engage in beyond the classroom as well. Now, in terms of the resume, the core building blocks that we focus on the most are activities. In some cases, obviously, awards as well. But activities really are the main aspect of building a resume that many people focus on. That being said, activities, while great, also have some potential disadvantages. And pursuits that are maybe a bit less formal than activities, or that we wouldn't typically consider legitimate activities for a student's candidacy or their college admissions, they may actually bear a lot of promise for the student's hook, whether that has to do with identifying the hook, determining what that passion actually is that we're going to be pursuing or building out further over multiple years. And in other cases, the hobbies actually themselves, in some cases, can be branded, more or less as activities and as, building blocks of a student's resume in the actual application itself. Now, what I want to do is I want to discuss 7 different advantages of hobbies, right? And you could sort of say in maybe informal pursuits more broadly construed, but I'm gonna particularly focus here on hobbies because I think this is sort of the bucket that is the most important and salient here. So I'm going to cover 7 different advantages, 7 different major pros to hobbies and why they could significantly improve a student's candidacy building, particularly their hook identification and their hook building, and significantly improve their applications and ultimately their odds of getting into a top and highly selective college. So, number one, hobbies are highly passion driven. They are already sort of oozing with passion. So, the main fuel of hobbies is passion. The main fuel of activity sometimes is more, things like willpower, discipline, or have to do it, to get into a good college. And so activities can come across as a little bit, in some cases, potentially being more subject to looking contrived or performative. Hobbies, on the other hand, are what you do. And I've said this often on the podcast, real true passion is what you do when nobody's looking, right? So it's when there's no club advisor or no teacher hovering over you. It's not during school hours. It's not, between two bells ringing, in the school. It exists outside of the bounds of typical structure and of typical obligations, right? And so it's a lot more making use of a student's discretionary time, right? How they actually choose of their own will, of their own volition, how they actually choose to spend their time. And it's very unfortunate because many people overlook these informal pursuits, these hobbies, these discretionary uses of students' time simply because they don't sort of register in the same way as a high school club, right? A high school club is, we sort of pair that with the admissions process and an application and an activities list. But that way of thinking is very dangerous and it can lead you down a path to easily overlooking aspects of a student's candidacy that are very powerful, very compelling, and potentially very unique that could really move the needle for their candidacy. And it's very common that many students, many parents, if we have them fill out a background form or fill out a resume, they don't put things in some cases like hobbies or, less formal pursuits is we have to kind of ask the questions in different ways and sort of make it clear, okay, well, okay, here's your activities, but then also what are other informal passions or what other ways that you spend your free time? So we make sure we're not missing anything, right? That could actually be a very powerful driver of a student's interest, their passions, and ultimately their candidacy. Hobbies are great because again, they're highly discretionary. It's what you do when nobody's looking. It's what you do when you're not forced to do something. They run off passion and they run off of intrinsic motivation. And one of the things that I also say very often in this process is if we want to build the best possible candidacy, and I'm looking at a student as a prospect for getting into an elite college and sort of trying to handicap their odds, particularly since we work with a lot of very young students. And so there's a lot more uncertainty as to, will the student be viable? One of the things that I often say is that I basically want to own as much of the student's discretionary time as possible. And what I mean by that is I want them working on their candidacy as many hours in a given week as possible because that will give them the greatest chance of success. It makes sense, right? We are college advisors. Our main job is to improve the student's candidacy and to get an excellent outcome in this process. It certainly stands to reason that the students who are willing to spend more time building their candidacy versus the students who are not as willing to spend more time, that the first group of students are going to have a much higher odds of admission, all else being equal, right? But how do we actually accomplish that? How do we get the students to spend a high degree of their discretionary time building their college candidacy? Well, we try to get them to do things that they actually like doing in the short term. And in doing that, what we basically have accomplished is we've aligned long-term incentives or long-term goals with short-term incentives or short-term rewards, right? And so we don't need persuasion when we have natural and organic compliance because the student simply likes what they're doing. And as I have gained more and more experience and more insight and seen the students who really build exceptional candidacies, it does, at the end of the day, very often come back to the students truly loving and enjoying what they're working on and that alignment of short term rewards with long term goals and objectives. These hobbies or any informal pursuits or interests that a student has, how they are already spending their discretionary time is great fodder for auditing their interest and determining the direction of their potential hook building and their candidacy building. Number two, hobbies or informal pursuits more broadly, they are less subject to availability bias or sort of default biases, which means that they have more differentiation potential to them versus activities, which are many of them are very common and very cliche and very overused and appear very often at a very high frequency in many different students' applications, which means that they can't differentiate you if they're in so many different students' applications. You do DECA, you do robotics, you do newspaper, but as we often say, there are 30,000 student councils, there's 30,000 high school newspapers, there's 30,000, whatever it is. Those things being in front of everybody's eyes, there is a benefit of that, right? There's a benefit to a high school club. It is right there. And so there's a benefit of the availability, right? It doesn't seem as far out of reach potentially to joining a club, starting a club, founding a club, making contributions because it's right there, for their taking for everybody in most cases. But the flip side of that, or the negative side, is it also very often is not a major differentiator because it's available to everybody. This availability bias is a major issue in admissions when something is sort of in front of everybody's eyes, or the other person, the neighbor's doing it or the family friend's doing it. And then other people, try to copy them or they try to copy the older kid who got into the college, right? You end up with a lot of this just blending in. Candidacy just all blending in with each other. It's the summer programs, it's the pre-college summer programs. Everybody just has very similar looking candidacies. Now, When it comes to hobbies, they sort of move from the bounds of school and structure and highly recurrent themes. You have very common categories. We did an episode of the 6 most cliche activities. There's very common categories that tend to occur, right? You have sports, you have community service, you have music or an instrument. There are very common categories that tend to occur in students' activities when they're formal and more structured pursuits. But if we sort of open it up more and we sort of open it up more to, individual agency, there are tons and tons and tons of different discretionary uses of a student's time, right? They could love building arcade machines. They could love ants. They could love whatever it is, right? Collecting stamps, collecting coins. There tends to be a little bit more opportunity for differentiation, and differentiation really is the backbone of being a highly competitive candidate for highly selective colleges where there is such great pressure on a student's standing out and being different, right? As I say, in order to get a different outcome from other people, in order to get a different output, you need to have different inputs, right? So, this is another big advantage of hobbies. There's less availability bias, there's less accessibility to everyone, and there's more and greater capacity for differentiation and the student really tapping into potentially a much more unique value proposition and a much more unique application and hook. The weirder that your hobbies or your interests are, contrary to what many of you teenagers out there may think in terms of, oh, that's weird. Oh, he's weird. Oh, she's weird. Well, I have news for you. A lot of those weird kids stand out in the admissions process and they steal spots from the kids who are less weird because weird means you're different and different gives you an opportunity to get a different outcome from the one that most get, which is a rejection at most top colleges, right? So if you particularly have weirder hobbies or different hobbies, great to lean into those. Number 3, hobbies arbitrage the work play trade off. So, what do I mean by that? Well, this is another opportunity to use my favorite word in the world, which is arbitrage. But besides that, what I mean is when you have a hobby, you get the benefits of it feeling like play, but you also get potentially the outputs of work and sort of the productivity benefits potentially of work. And so you have sort of arbitraged this work play trade off because when many people, a student sort of thinking about work time and that's going to school and doing my homework, it's sort of eating your vegetables and doing your chores. And that relies a lot more on, sort of discipline and willpower and those sorts of systems, right? And then there's sort of, the concept of free time and playing video games and hanging out with friends and eating ice cream and, et cetera, et cetera. Well, hobbies are excellent because they feel like play. They sort of get counted in terms of the student's subjective experience as play, right? But if particularly, their intellectual components, or we can make this relevant, it doesn't always have to be very classically academic or intellectual, the hobby. I've very often said you can turn almost any passion into something that is academically relevant at a college and or would be relevant to the extracurricular community of the college. So a lot of people worry a little bit too much and get a little too rigid about something in terms of how you convert it to an actual college major. And maybe that's just something that I sort of, take for granted that we are much more, experienced with how to do that and how to take things that are maybe seem informal or that people aren't really sure how you would turn that into an academic hook. And so maybe I'm taking that a little bit for granted. That being said, there really is infinite capacity for turning almost any passion or any hobby or any interest into something that you could bring to a college, right? And turning it into a hook. If we sort of get the play benefits, right? And this sort of feels like play, but we also are consolidating a passion and, evidencing it. We also potentially get these very positive upsides potentially for the student's actual candidacy, and we get the benefits of it also seeming like work as well. Number 4, So hobbies, as I sort of alluded to earlier, they piggyback on existing discretionary time. And so they basically utilize current skills, current interest, current passions. They make use of current resource allocation. And one of the things that we really try to do in this process, and that I'm very big on, and it becomes even more important the later that you get and the less time that you have, is you have to use whatever you have, right? And so what a lot of people do is they try to start from ground zero very often, right? And so I had mentioned this sort of like experimenter concept, right? You get a student, they're younger, they want to sort of stay in this high degree of exploration mindset. I want to try this, and then I'll try that, and then I want to try that. But the problem is you're constantly starting over. You're not getting any momentum. You're not being highly intentional with your time, and you just will lose to a student who is stacking and compounding pre-existing skills and time allocations, provided that they are, useful. So when you keep starting over, you keep going back to zero. And there are few things that I hate more in this process than starting at zero, right? We always want to try to find a way to piggyback on existing skills, piggyback on existing things a student already has in their resume, accomplishments. And even if a student is super young, we still never want to start at zero. Even if they're in seventh grade, we still want to, what are some accomplishments? What are some things that you've done? Even if, again, even if they're more informal, they're more hobbies. So we're not starting at ground zero. And what that does is it also de-risks things a bit. When you're just running an experiment from scratch, first of all, you don't have the skill sets, right? Which adds risk, and it adds executional risk. We don't know if you're going to like it if you're starting at ground zero. So that adds risk. It basically adds passion risk, which also adds executional risk. And a large part of this process is de-risking things. And what better way to de-risk whether a student likes something? Because I would prefer to know that they like it now instead of starting from ground zero in terms of they might like it, they may not like it, and then we find out in 6 months that they don't like it. But now 6 months is gone, right? And well, if you have 2.5 years to build a candidacy, 6 months is 20% of your time. That's a lot of time to have wasted. In an ideal world, we don't want to start at ground zero, and we want to sort of use this piggybacking concept, right? This sort of current resource utilization. This is sort of the concept with the brain, how the brain evolved. It doesn't, very often create entirely new de novo neural architecture if it can simply reappropriate existing neural architecture to serve some new function, right? And so you see things such as, social shame uses the same neural architecture as physical pain, right? They're fairly related concepts and they are similar, but you can sort of reappropriate architecture that already exists versus incurring the cost of starting it de novo or from scratch. And so this piggybacking concept is very powerful. And when a student uses their hobbies and leverages these existing uses of discretionary time, this is powerful fuel and a great starting point for building a compelling hook and a compelling candidacy as well. Number five, and I sort of alluded to this as well earlier on, hobbies seem a lot more organic and far less potentially performative. That is for the reasons that I've already sort of articulated. This is how a student sort of exists somewhat in their organic, natural state, right? Again, there's no teacher, there's no school, there's no structure. It sits outside of potentially a lot of social influence or influence, by virtue of peers or teachers or academic structure or, compulsions. This is one of the issues with the community service, particularly if a high school has a certain community service threshold or even a community service ethos. This might sound great, a lot of these, private schools, boarding schools, right? It's all, community service and, whatever it is, maybe you go to a Catholic school. But the problem is that when service is too closely connected to obligation or structure, it doesn't again seem discretionary, and it doesn't necessarily I don't know whether, the student would have done it otherwise. Hobbies are, again, great fodder for what the student does, that is actually a genuine passion and a genuine pursuit, and they are far less subject to the performative liabilities that some activities are particularly subject to. Number 6, and, quite relatedly, to number 5 and many of these other concepts, intellectual vitality is one of the most important concepts in elite admissions, and it's one of the most highly valued traits by highly selective colleges. And intellectual vitality is basically loving learning for the sake of learning, not loving learning because of what it gets you, not loving getting A's because everybody pats you on the back and says you did a good job and you get gold stars and it improves your social status or your status within the group, right? Or improves your sort of your rank. That's not what colleges are after. They're not after mercenaries, they're after missionaries, as I very often say. And many of these schools specifically try to weed out students where it does feel overly transactional. They don't want to go to college to learn or to be, around other smart and aspirational students and to sort of contribute, but they just want to go to the school just for what it simply provides them. And it looks and feels like a transaction. Right? That's not a great feeling, and that will not evoke a feeling of really wanting to root for you as a candidate when admissions officers read your application, right? And so intellectual vitality, it really is exuding a love of learning, curiosity, passion. And again, the best way to sort of exude these things or to sort of convey the genuineness of them is when you are outside of structure, right? And you are utilizing discretionary effort and discretionary time, right? And so, given that elite admissions favor students with passion who love learning, who are curious, who are genuine about these things, hobbies really lean into that. And so they naturally lean into intellectual vitality. And by virtue of leaning into intellectual vitality, they lean into a major advantage for a student's candidacy and a major trait that can help you earn admission to highly selective colleges. Number 7, hobbies are great potential creative content for essays and your applications down the line. They are a little bit more difficult to fit into things like activities lists and additional information, though they're not impossible and you definitely can do it. But they are great for stories and anecdotes and opening hooks, essays, because they really bridge the divide of two things you're trying to do, which is you're trying to signal intellect and passion, but you're also trying to show some personality and some fun and be interesting at the same time, right? And so hobbies are potentially a great nexus of some of these creative elements, these more emotional elements. And again, they sort of can exude fun and joy, but they also can tap back into the sort of backbone of the student's hook and their actual interests in terms of how they are presenting themselves and what that actual hook is that's being presented in the application, right? And there are many students who are too over indexed on one or the other. There's a student who's sort of too much of the personality in the application, and they fall too much into the personal part of the personal essay, and it doesn't really have anything to do with their hook or any sort of intellectual academic concepts. And then there are students who are on the other extreme, where they're all logic. With no emotion, no personality, and they read like a very boring, dry, technical, abstract, right? For a research paper, right? And those students, they're very over-indexed on the logical components, but they're under-indexed on the emotional components. Other students are very over-indexed on the emotional and personality components, but they're under-indexed on the logical components. And so hobbies do serve as a nice potential balance between the two. Okay, so let's talk a little bit here about the early parts of the candidacy building process and the late parts of the candidacy building process and where hobbies come in. So, as I mentioned, hobbies are really excellent for the discovery process, particularly for younger students. And if you don't have as many formal activities yet, or the student's not in high school, even if they are in high school, they're still great to audit in terms of doing discovery for what a student's hook's going to be. But especially for younger students who might not have as many, sort of quote unquote formal activities, right? That really look and feel like what you typically think of when you think of an activity for college admissions, right? And so these are great vehicles for the discovery process, really auditing what a student is genuinely passionate about because this is already how they choose and elect to spend their free time, right? And we want to piggyback on that. We want to basically ride that wave as much as possible because by riding that wave, we align short term rewards, short term joy with long term goals. And so these are really excellent. I've mentioned many times that if are sort of auditing things, whether it's your activities for what's going to go in your application, you want to see everything. You want to see all of the information, the whole big picture. So many people, when they audit and they do a resume, and they're looking and they're doing discovery process, they only focus on the formal activities and they forget about all these other things that they do. And very often it's the case that a student has something that they sort of overlook that is actually much more powerful and compelling than some of their, what look to be more formal activities, right? And that is for the very simple reason as well that a lot of students, they're just thinking, they're in this sort of very programmatic mindsets of thinking of, these things sort of quote unquote count for college admissions and these other things over here don't. But what makes those other things really valuable for college admissions, maybe the less formal things, is they are driven, they're fueled by higher intellectual vitality, more passion, and they may not be what everybody else is thinking about, which can make them more differentiating, right? And so hobbies are great fodder and great fuel for identifying how you're going to go about building your candidacy and what your hook will actually be. Now, in terms of the later parts of the process, so I mentioned a student that we had several years back. This is just an example. He was really into shipwreck diving. We basically took his shipwreck diving. We used that for his personal essay. As you can imagine, these were historical shipwrecks. So the student was very interested in history. And so that became his admissions hook. An anecdote, the story that we painted about, him diving for this particular shipwreck was an amazing story. It was relevant to his hook. And so it served that purpose. And then we even formalized, I think he actually had another activity as well where he was doing, he had created some sort of game that was also related to history. And he was sort of running this game with some friends. And, we actually were able to sort of, formalize that a little bit in terms of its optics in the application. We actually did turn it into an activity and put it in the activities list. And then the shipwreck diving, we put in the additional information section, albeit the additional information section was a little bit longer at that point in time than it currently is. But we took that shipwreck diving and we sort of made it look more legitimate and formal and expounded upon it in the same way that you might expound upon a student who runs a business or an organization. And so you sort of try to put some structure and some bullets. How many shipwreck dives did the student do? Maybe some bullets as to, the historical significance, right? What was the technical equipment or the technical skill that was required, right? And so you try to formalize it in the same way that if a student ran a business, you would talk about gross revenue, profit, items sold, number of states the student, has customers in, these sort of measurable impact, these sort of legitimacy factors, right? You try to formalize it and professionalize it a little bit more. Now, in terms of whether you're going to take a hobby or hobbies and, put them in your application, it really depends by the student's case. That student happened many years ago. Was starting later on in the process, and so he particularly didn't really have a choice because he had fewer formal activities to make use of and to support his hook. And so for people who are on that sort of side of the fence, who are later and maybe lower in terms of some formal pursuits, there might be a higher necessity for you doing this and putting some of these hobbies or these informal pursuits in your application. And we saw that with our strategy for high school senior episode that we had a couple of falls ago. He had a hobby in model rocketry, And so he's talked in that episode about that hobby and the intellectual vitality there, potentially using it for some essays, like the community essay, what communities you belong to. A lot of people come with a very cliche response to that that's just related to their cultural background or their religious background. But if he came up with a response and we were going to make it very sort of, dramatic and sort of punchy and sort of say, he was part of a community of rocket scientists, right? And talk about how he was reading online forums and figuring out better ways to build the rockets would have been potentially very worthwhile in his case because he was lower in terms of formal activities and was starting very late, right? But this really depends on the particular student case and what all their other activities look like and what the rest of their candidacy looks like. That's always going to be the case when it comes to the applications. It's all contextual, right? Depending on what else the student has. And obviously, you're working with a certain finite amount of limited space. So you need to present the best, most compelling picture that you possibly can given the space that you are afforded. But that being said, it is totally possible to take informal pursuits, try to make them sound more professional or more legitimate, possibly put them in your activities list, maybe even in the honors section, depending on if you had some, superlative or tangible accomplishment that came out of them. And certainly in the additional information section as well, depending again on what the rest of the information looks like for the student. We've talked about all the sort of benefits of hobbies, and there are many. We talked about how you can use them in the earlier parts of the process, how you can use them in the later parts of the process. But I do want to leave off with some potential caveats as well. And so, anytime that we talk about the strengths of a given, a strategy or aspect of the admissions process, or even the strength of a candidate, very often there is another side of that, which is the strengths very often are the weaknesses. This is true with hobbies, right? What makes them strong and gives them their advantages, well, that also produces some of their weaknesses and their liabilities, right? And so, as I mentioned, hobbies are great for, high passion, high intellectual vitality, how the students sort of, how they utilize their discretionary time. And they can be very heavy on sort of the emotional aspects of the process, and I bifurcated this in our episode, The Perfect Activity for Ivy Plus Colleges. And I talked about there are the logical parts of an application, and then there are the emotional components of an application, right? And the logical components are, things like measurable impact and scale factors, and number of items sold, or, how much you scaled an organization, how many people work for your business, how few people win a certain award, right? Those are sort of the logical aspects, right? They sort of tap into the prefrontal cortex. But they don't necessarily move a person. They don't move another human being, and for the real moving a human being and creating a very significant rooting interest in your application and being very interesting and being very likable, those are more the emotional aspects, right? And to really have the most powerful application, you need to bridge the emotional aspects with the logical aspects, right? Those are the most powerful candidates. The hobbies are really great for a lot of emotional aspects of the application and the intellectual vitality, but they can be weaker or lower on some of the logical aspects, right? And what's the reason for that? Well, they are very discretionary uses of a student's time, and they may just be things that the student's sort of doing solo, independently. And so hobbies can lack potentially legitimacy, they can lack formality, right? And so it's the opposite of sort of what made them, really useful is they exist outside of structure and maybe what other people are doing, but also because you're sort of a bit of a lone wolf and we don't really know exactly what you're doing, in your bedroom in front of the computer late at night, it doesn't have as much potential corroboration by people who would be writing you maybe recommendation letters or, a teacher talking about it, in a recommendation letter or, you having measurable impact or scale or involving others and showing collaboration or leadership, right? And so what makes hobbies really great also again is a bit of potentially their Achilles heel. Particularly, I will say as well, we saw in that Stanford application review episode. And so that student was sort of doing, quote unquote, diabetes research. but it was very unclear. They were sort of totally doing it by themselves. There was no sort of mentor, there was no publication, there was nothing, no sort of tangible outputs. It wasn't sort of maybe linked to an independent study in school. There wasn't really a legitimate container around the activity. And then it can seem questionable, and you're not really sure. It's much more subject to the student maybe exaggerating. So research in particular is something a student can definitely do independent research, but it does ideally need to have these sort of legitimacy stamps, more or less, whether it's being submitted to a journal, even if it's a high school journal, or there's at least somebody else who's sort of giving feedback or mentoring the student on the research project, or it's connected to a high school class and a capstone or an independent study class. Research, particularly, does thrive off of structure, legitimacy, and formality, as an example of one type of activity that we talk a lot about. So you do have to be careful in terms of the hobbies. It's not, as I often say, an either or. The answer is always a both and. It's not a matter of having the emotional components and the high intellectual vitality and the fun, or having the logical and legitimacy and the awards and the research professor at an institution, or having, again, those measurable scale factors. It's not either or. You don't want to be well rounded in this process, I very say, in terms of having a million different interests and not being focused. But at least in terms of tapping into these different aspects of what makes a compelling candidate, you do want to be well rounded. You want to have the emotional components, uh, as well as the logical components. You don't wanna be too over-indexed on one or the other. You do want to have, more formal, more structured activities that seem more legitimate, and they have, again, very measurable impact or scale factors. They're supervised. You wanna have those high legitimacy activities, or high scale, high measurable impact, or honors, awards, etcetera. And then you also do want to be able to convey that it's not just performative, and you're not just all structure and formality, and maybe you're just doing this, just to get in. You do want to convey yourself as a student who is genuinely curious, genuinely interested in whatever the areas are that you're presented to the college. And you want to, again, present as a student who truly loves what they're working on, is genuinely excited by learning, and is genuinely passionate about these things, even outside of structure. As I said, it's not an either or, and you really don't want to use hobbies just by themselves unless you end up in fall of senior year and you basically have no formal activities. And the student's just been doing things, like I said, in front of their computer screen, in their bedroom, late at night. If you're forced into that position, well, then you have no choice but to make best use of what you actually have. But for everybody else, hobbies should not be lone vehicles for a student's candidacy building. That should seem fairly obvious to many people. They are great to use, again, for the discovery parts of the process, identifying a student's hook, and they are great to pair with or convert into formal activities. So they sort of can look a lot like these sort of precursors to more formal activities, or they could sit parallel or adjacent to formal activities. But they're not great, in many cases, just by themselves or in lieu of more formal extracurriculars. One last caveat here: you do want to be careful, as with anything, any form of guidance. There are always nuances and always contextual nuances, and there's different students in different cases and different fields and different areas. And so you do want to be careful with hobbies that are a lot more cliche. So for students, for example, who are interested in engineering, your Legos hobby, talking about that in your essays, or how you like to take apart computers, right? Or build computers. There are also, in any given domain or any given major, any given academic field, there are also going to be a lot of potentially cliche hobbies, right? So you do have to be careful. And there are certain fields, as I've mentioned, CS, engineering in particular, where a lot of those fields, the work is in many ways very adjacent to play, right? These are fields that are very characterized by high intellectual vitality and high intellectual vitality students who, since a very young age, have been very passionate and have pursued these interests quite informally. It's very easy to code on your own or to teach yourself coding or to build things around the house. And so there are certain fields where they're already characterized by a very high degree of intellectual vitality, organic curiosity, and the student potentially having pursued, these interests in a more informal capacity and a hobby-like capacity. So you do have to sort of use some discretion here in terms of, okay, great, hobbies are awesome, but I'm another, boy, who's doing engineering, and maybe I don't want to talk about how I loved, taking apart computers or building them, or playing with Legos. That may not really break the mold and differentiate you too much. That is it for this episode. We went through 7 different major advantages that hobbies have in this process for making students highly competitive for elite colleges, how we can sort of utilize them, particularly to identify a student's hook and to build their candidacy, how we might put them in the applications, and then also some potential caveats and drawbacks as well. But drawbacks that can easily be fixed or weaknesses that could easily be shored up by simply pairing your hobbies with other more legitimate, formal, structured pursuits and endeavors as well. That is it for this episode. Hopefully, this was helpful to everyone, and we will talk soon in the next one. Bye bye.